Hey there everybody, thanks for joining me for another one-man review. Today I will be taking a look at Gypsy, the omnibus put out by Inside Comics, which is a company I'm going to have to look up because I've never heard of them, but this is a really nice package. It's a collection of the old heavy metal story by Terry Smolderen and Enrico Marini that I'm sure a lot of you, if you were reading heavy metal like during the 90s, you're familiar with this character and this project. I've had this book for probably a couple years now. I've grabbed it for like $10 or something like that, $9 at an Ollie's. So apparently it didn't sell very well, and the book got remaindered, and I was able to grab a copy of it. I remember enjoying the art when I would see these in the heavy metal. My impression was that the story was kind of silly and episodic, but it had cool art. So because it was so cheap, I grabbed it, and kind of finally had a break. I slowed down my ordering of new books, so I'm able to check out some of the ones where it's like I've read this, but not in a long time. And I actually really wound up enjoying this. I got to see the full story rather than just the bits and pieces that I got here in heavy metal. And I think that's part of what formed my impression of the story, was seeing it kind of in pieces like that. I didn't get the full scope of it. But it is kind of just a straightforward action-adventure type of comic, just with really nice art. And that's, if you're going to get this, like, that's what you're getting into. You kind of know it. So we start off somewhere in Eastern Europe at the beginning of the 21st century. We're in like a kind of post-apocalyptic world here. You can see by the art that it's an interesting combination of Japanese and European influences at the time. Like, I very much in the early stuff get the sense that like colored versions of Akira were probably something that the artist saw and kind of influence what was going on here, but then a lot of like the European color strategies and things like that. There's a description here of what's going on in this world. It's pretty much like a global warming event has then caused a new ice age, is kind of the sense of what I get from the opening story. That changes a little bit in the later stories, but the characters are talking about the ozone. And funnily, they're saying, like, we're going to outlaw planes because of the ozone. So soon there'll only be trains, boats, and trucks, which I think now we understand is really not going to help things. But these big global, like, trucking networks are a big part of the story. And we're introduced to the two main characters. The titular character here is this Sugoi character who calls himself Gypsy later on. And we're seeing it here as a child with his younger sister, Oblivia. We get a 12-year time jump then to Oblivia and Gypsy are older now. She's seeking him out. He's like a roughneck trucker guy. I think in their minds they kind of had like a Sylvester Stallone, Kurt Russell for this character in mind, like if it would be played by a movie, like this kind of buff, rough and tumble ready roughneck brawler kind of guy. You can see this very 80s, 90s action movie thing going on in a lot of this. But also you can see, like I said again, you can see a lot of the Masamune Shirow, a lot of the Otomo influences combined with, like I said, the more European coloring and stuff. So it's a really cool vibe and something for the time that I think was really far ahead of the time in terms of being what Sean now calls like an international artist, someone who's taking inspiration from many different places. One of the big rivals throughout the story, since this is like a ice road trucker story, is a trucking company called the Selmer Company, and they're kind of going up against these independent truckers like the Gypsy. One of the biggest features of the opening story and kind of what sets the context for the whole world, for me at least in this story, is this gigantic transnational freeway that these truckers are on, the C3C, and you get a sense of what this story is. It's kind of like Mad Max meets Ice Road Truckers. You got a bunch of these crazy trucker people having these trucker battles, and that's happening up in the frozen wastelands of the world. And so it just sets up for a lot of really cool action scenes and things like that. My impression reading through the book was that it was all going to be one story split up into like 48-page chapters, which kind of made sense to me. But the more I read it, the more I realize that really it's only this first story that has like 3 episodes to it, and then they chunk off into smaller episodes. So I was under the impression, because the first story goes on for a while, that this was going to be the whole story, and that was kind of exciting to me. I get a little less excited after the 3 or 4 episodes when it goes away. But in this first kind of chunk, you're getting to know the characters in the world really well, and the Selmer company. And also, a big part of the story is this missing heiress to the Selmer company, Burma Selmer. And that just kind of setting the picture for all the major players in the world. Beyond being prophetic in the sense of that there's going to be some kind of global crisis with the weather, we get a post-apocalyptic world. We also see some interesting ideas in here that we're getting close to now, like auto-driving vehicles. So the Gypsy is able to kind of go back to his little, like, almost kingdom in his cabin that he's got here, and just let the truck drive itself. Trucking would be a lot better if that's what it was. I would think you could just let the truck do the work. But you can see that the premise of the Ice War Truckers meets Mad Max leads to a lot of really cool opportunities for visuals. And Marini's such a fantastic artist. He can really take advantage of all of that and be so cinematic. I really particularly like this spread where the action goes like this and trails across a spread in a sneaky way. I'm not sure I see a lot of that in comics, and I think this one is particularly well done. And yeah, it opens up the room needed for these types of illustrations. In this first story, and continuing on through all of the stories, one of the major arcs is this character, the sorceress, and she is involved in a group called the White Wing, kind of an occult group. And so that's a major player throughout all of the stories, even once we move past this first setup here. At this point in the story, she's seducing Gypsy and lying to him, saying that she is the missing heiress, Burma Selmer, but that's not actually the case. We'll find that out later. But he thinks that he's going to be trading her in for the bounty that he's going to get on her head, basically. Another major player that you get introduced to in the first series that continues to be important throughout is Bridget Mayton. She's the cousin of Burma Selmer and someone who's still working at Selmer Corps. You can see again in the art here, there's just like some wonderful, fantastical images imagining these big ships. And I really, really, really like in the art that all the coloring is done physically, even though we have some things that look kind of like computer cuts. Obviously, the artist is working with like watercolors and inks and gouaches, things like that, to get some really cool color effects going on. And then a lot of like airbrushing too, it looks like. Color is important all throughout the book, but especially in these earlier ones, and in the middle, you get some really nice color combinations and some really nice color transitions, like moving from the cooler colors here in the snow with these little pops of warm, kind of prepping you for it, and then like a half and half sea page, and then moving into the warmer sequences, I think are really nice. And yeah, with like the airbrushing and the actual physical colors over physical colors, they're kind of just some colors that you could get digitally, but you just don't normally see because they're made out of the way colors combine by going on top of each other. And so if you did a gradient on the computer, it'd look kind of different. It's really cool to see that stuff, and I miss seeing that. And I really like the way that it's used in here, where there is some very textural stuff, and then there's some stuff that very much looks like cell shading. And I think that being done physically adds a lot to the art as well. So I quite like that style, and I wish there was more stuff going on that was made like that. A fun little reference here, I think these stories were 1990, so before Jurassic Park would have hit the theaters, but definitely it would have been a book already. They're talking about a famous park where they cloned mammoths. So I wonder if they were reading, if Smolderen was reading Michael Crichton and getting some ideas from there. But just to give you a sense of like the kind of scope of the adventures in here as well, that they include a lot of these fun little side stories and little things like a mammoth showing up. Gypsy and his sister wind up rescuing this kid who is like out in the snow, and it looks like he's going to be raped by this much larger gentleman. They save him, not knowing who he is and all this stuff. He winds up being the Tsar Ivan, who's out there, obviously in Russia now, and he's out trying to lead a rebellion to put himself back in power, and that plays out through the story. There's the White Wings are part of that. As we move into like the second and the third volumes of the story, still all in that same first storyline, something's going on with the coloring. I don't know what it is. It looks to me, because the line art still seems pretty clear, but it looks to me like they didn't have good resources for 2 of the volumes worth of the colors, because it's like they got the colors on a smaller file and then blew them up, and so it looks like pixelated and rasterized, kind of like all of the cool textures and stuff that you get from the airbrushes and all of the things that I really appreciate about the color in terms of color choices are there, but a lot of the textural stuff just looks really blurry and faded out. That made me suspicious that there is some digital coloring going on in some of these volumes, where it's like a lot of it's being done on paper and there's digital stuff being done later, and I'll show more of that once there's a crisper thing. I don't know how much any of this shows up on screen anyways, but there's 2 stories here where it seems like something's wrong with the color aspect of the files, but not the line art, which makes it even weirder. Or maybe the line art's getting caught up in the blur, but I'm not noticing it because everything's in color. I'm not sure, but there's something weird going on, which is unfortunate because the rest of the book is so beautifully reproduced. It leaves me assuming that there's just a loss of resources there, and that means you're losing the resources on some really beautiful original art. We find out in this part that there's basically a race to get to this city or this fortress called Giganks, and it's occupied by a Mr. Slow-Mo. That's this character here. This is kind of where the revolution and everything is headed towards. All the weapons are going there, and you find out more about the politics of that situation. We also find out who the real Burma Selmer is. She's like one of the revolutionary figures. So there's some good, well, I guess I gave away the spoilers, but some good like thriller twists here and there as we go. Some, again, really nice coloring. I think Marini's best when he's balancing the warms against the cools. Some of the other sequences lean into more like monochromatic or analogous color palettes. I think these ones where the warm and the cool are balanced are really, really nice. But yeah, you can just get a sense of like the world building that's going on in here as well, the types of world that we're exposed to. One of my favorite parts about the writing is the writing of the expressions that the Gypsy character is constantly saying. Like anytime he's shocked about something, he'll say something ridiculous but totally different than what he said before. So this one particularly stood out. By all the nasty rashes my forefathers got from pissing in nettles. And just that, like, that would be a fun thing to sit around and write. So I can see that the writer is having fun with this. So this is nearing the end of the first story. It takes place over 3, I think, volumes, maybe 4 volumes. After this wraps up, the volumes become more episodic. It's like that's probably the story that they wanted to tell, and then it was popular, and they realized they could keep going, and they obviously set themselves up for a world where they could keep telling many stories. But it does become more episodic, even though the storyline of like the White Wing and the Sorceress and all that kind of plays out through these smaller episodes. In this one here, the first of these more episodic things, you find a little bit more about the Gypsy's past and a cousin of his that's going to become a big player, and the second cousin, Myrno. Then we jump to the future, and we meet the adult Myrno and his partner, Milena, who was also one of their friends as a kid. Myrno and Milena are very much they're very materialistic people. They're interested in wealth and fancy things, and that's a great offset to the very much like I'm all about freedom, who cares about stuff character of the Gypsy. I also really like in this story that they introduced this Rosalind character, who's a girl who through an injury has lost the use of her legs, and she's trying to go get a surgery to reestablish the connection of to unpinch the nerve that's keeping her disabled. And obviously me having Tori needing to be in a wheelchair if we go out anywhere for a long period of time. Like, of course, when I see that then showing up in a story and like an interesting character who's also disabled and in a wheelchair in this action setting is just pretty cool, and I enjoy seeing that. One of the fun, like, structural things going on in the writing of this by Terry Smolderen is that throughout this chapter, there's also a World Cup game going on, and the characters are using the distractedness of the German population paying attention to the World Cup to pull off the job that they're doing. So that's a really interesting strategy of having like this other sub-narrative that really, as the audience, you're not involved in, but everyone in this story is involved in. I think that's a really interesting strategy, because like by the end of it, I don't really care if Germany or France wins. Like, it's not a sports manga that's getting me invested in that, but it's a very cool tool that it almost works not like a bookend, but it's like this frame that everything else hangs on and provides motivation for all of the bit players in the story. And I just really like that. In the next story, we pick up on the story of the White Wing and the Sorceress again. In this story, we go back to the color part of the art being presented accurately, and it makes me really, really sad that I'm missing out on the full color work in these previous stories, because the color work in this compared to the opening scene is just, or the opening few volumes is absolutely gorgeous. You see that the manga aspect of things, like the Otomo Shiro stuff, is going away. There's less of the hatching, like the ink work is becoming more about just providing contour lines and colors. There's a lot more painting going on. And the richness of the painting, the richness of the colors is all ramped up. And I just think there's some beautiful art going on in this portion of the book. And I suspect that given the colors and stuff that I'm seeing in the two volumes that are kind of poorly reproduced, it would have had this, it's almost like the Richard Corbin like lushness and roundness on things. It's really lovely, but it still preserves some of this sense of like almost being digitally colored as well, even though you're getting the sense that things are physical. And you can see here moving from colors again, very warm, introducing the cools and expanding the cools and moving into a cool sequence. Just a lot of very masterful stuff going on all throughout this with color and with everything else. I mean, the cartooning's obviously fire as well, and that more cleaned up line work, that a little bit slicker, more Disney approach, I guess, to the line work also makes everything really bouncy. You can see that it leads to a lot of like really great acting moments, especially for someone like Gypsy, who's such a stylized character. Some more of just the beautiful color palettes on display here. Really enjoy them looking over the city with the bits of orange. I just think there's a lot going on in here to recommend. We move into some of the less contrasty palettes, a little bit more subdued. We just get some really beautiful paintings here where there's no line work. This is all being done in paint. I would love to see more like this, but also still all this great cartooning and acting. Amazing compositions, amazing sense of space and place. Really great job of breaking like foreground and background into two shapes, but then subdividing them up into lots of other shapes. I just really obsessing over like this panel and a lot of this art when I was looking at it, because it's really truly beautiful. And even though you do have a lot of things that look fairly computerized, there's a little bit of extra texture going on that you don't get when you computerize things. This naturalness of like a paper that's unpredictable showing up in the art, and it's just really, really lovely to look at. In this one, we're introduced to a character named Eva Dargold, and Gypsy's showing up trying to be as manicured as he can be, as posh as he can be for society. His sister Oblivia's like, he's been paying for her to be in boarding school throughout the whole book, so she's more high society than him. I had to think, though, because this Eva Dargold character is being talked about as someone who's involved in publishing, and she edited this book, Oblivion, it really makes me wonder, these probably came out originally by Dargaud, I believe. That would make sense, just the story. I don't know, it came out through Heavy Metal, though. There wasn't really copyright information in here either. I threw away a dust jacket a long time ago, so maybe it's on there. But anyways, I thought maybe that was some kind of inside joke for the Bandes and Company Dargaud in there. In this volume, where the colors get richer and everything, I do wonder if it is all 100% physical, because there's some stuff going on in some of the panels that looks like maybe what's happening is there's an ink wash being put down along with the inks, maybe some color being put down, but then maybe some stuff happening digitally. I'm just not sure. If not, Marini is getting much smoother with the color application, like technically way more in control, getting richer colors, a richer range of colors. So I don't know if it's a tool swap that led to that, or if there's just, a leveling up of material control going on. But it may be possible that there's a lot of physical things going on in here and then maybe some digital. I'm not sure. I think this is by far visually the most impressive volume. You also get at this point Marini's like in full control of his powers as a cinematic storyteller. So you have like the typical James Bond roof chase parkour scene, and the action throughout it is just so well drawn and so well tracked. Like this character's coming to throw a punch, he punches him there, moves out of the way. Just the threading throughout is always great. We're introducing her. She's part of this now. Now we're here. We're jumping off together. A quick trip on the inside. And then some really, like, just absolutely, that's as good as it gets. It doesn't get better than that. Art doesn't get better than that. Compositionally, the cartooning, the sense of dynamics, the fact that it's obviously all made up because like it's not photorealistic. There may be some reference there, but it's being distorted for artistic purposes. And then just the sequence here, like as we go through and they fall into the big baths there, it's just all like it's James Bond movie level fun, but with all of the freedom and lack of budget that you can have when you have an artist the level of Marini. And here you can see some more Marini operating. You have a really fun shout out to Asterix and Obelix going on here. I really think this chase sequence is just the backgrounds that are in here are amazing. The poses are amazing. I think this is the peak of the artwork in this book. It's got me wanting to look up more Marini's art, but I've seen some of the more recent stuff like the Batman, and it's definitely not whatever this is, because this is amazing. Just some more really beautiful spreads, just showing the kind of combination of the warm and the cool, the amazing acting and poses of all of the characters. And then here we have Oblivia in like a fantasy sequence. She's being drugged to try and get information out of her, and we have all this like Lawrence Alma Tadema neoclassical pillars with vines and flowers everywhere, and like these Orientalist beauties. It's just like really referencing an era of painting that I really love when you're talking about like Lawrence Alma Tadema, and then pulling it off really well in like an action story context. Just gorgeous stuff. You look at pages like this where you got all these like warm orange, yellow, reds up against all of these greens. Again, just some really amazing, Jackie Chan level choreography here on the fights and filming. It just brings me back to that era of like action hero movies. And obviously it was made during the time. It's pretty obvious. Like I said, there's Kurt Russell and Sylvester Stallone and a lot of actors like that, Steven Seagal, that are being put into the design of this character. But yeah, it's just the scope that they can tell in a story like this with not having to have the resources of a gigantic film. And it really shows, like, when you have someone who is as skilled of an artist, has as good of an imagination, as much control over anatomy and cartooning and perspective and all of that, that really comics is still the best storytelling medium for the imagination, because there is no budget on it. As we move into the last volume, everything that I think is great and successful about the previous volume kind of goes away, and the art style changes dramatically for the worse, I think. There's a lot more like desaturated colors. It's kind of like the difference between, the way the ink all was supposed to be colored, and then when they recolored it, and it looked like everything was like digital and into the grays that has this same look on here. There's also a lot of stuff going on in the effects that look maybe like they were done initially in watercolor, but then had some digital manipulation going on afterwards. I don't know if it was just the tone of the story that Marini decided to change to use more watercolor than gouache, but a lot of this stuff just looks like there's some component of digital in there. But given the cuts and things like that, the cell shading cuts and things in earlier volumes, I don't know, I'm not sure, like that could be painted as well. This is obviously all watercolor, and it works really, really well for this wet, nasty, rainy, muddy day. I think there's some really awesome material choices, but then there's some weird, almost, it just feels like things were adjusted digitally afterwards, or like shadows were put on things. Maybe it's all done with airbrush, but there's like some of these little glares around things that feel more digitally fakey, whereas in earlier volumes, the airbrush wasn't really used for that kind of stuff in that way. So I'm just really not sure how this was made, but it doesn't feel as lively and vibrant. It doesn't feel as grounded in actual materials. There's still a lot of really cool action sequences, but you can see that the colors, they just don't have the same tangible quality to them that they do in earlier volumes. And it just seems to get like more texturally messy too, because there's so much more of this watercolor stuff. I get that was probably a choice, but then there's like these weird, almost like that got put in digitally and then blurred out or something like that, where things feel kind of schlocky. But that said, there's still some really amazing, beautiful sequences that have some really good like cinematography to them. This one in particular, I enjoy, where Gypsy's going down this hill on this little hand cart somewhere in South America on this super tight little cliff. Almost gets run over by a tractor. Just the positioning of the camera, the poses, like all of that's so great. And as he chases them down into the jungle and everything gets greener, and then he hits the bump and goes flying, I just think this spread is like a masterfully handled sequence. But then you get some of that weird, like it looks like he went back in and did some weird bullshit digitally that kind of makes the art look funkier. So yeah, overall, really enjoyed this book. Really, really enjoyed the majority of the art. Even the stuff that I'm saying I didn't like as much is still obviously better than most comics that you're going to pick up. Really beautiful stuff. I definitely went and looked up to see what else Marini has done. The majority of what I found didn't look as nice as this. There was some Batman stuff that looked particularly kind of just modern and bad doorknob coloring type of art to me. But really enjoyed the story in this more than I anticipated. I knew I was going to enjoy the art, but having the time to like slow down and really soak it in, but I could probably spend more time on each panel than I spent on the whole book, how dense it is, but really getting to enjoy all of that. I was very glad I picked this up, very glad that I had a chance to grab it. And since I grabbed it in Ollie's, I would assume it shouldn't be very hard to find copies of these for cheap online. So get yourself one of these. This is a really nice addition to a collection, a lot of beautiful art, really masterful art that we could all be learning from.